By the autumn of 1946, the fragile peace in Vietnam had become little more than a thin sheet of glass. It still reflected the language of diplomacy. Agreements, committees, negotiations, official visits, and carefully chosen words. But beneath that surface, pressure was building. Every week brought new suspicion. Every patrol, every arrest, every checkpoint, every rumor seemed to push France and the Viet Minh closer to the edge. The war did not begin because one man alone demanded it. It began because two visions of Vietnam could no longer share the same streets. France still believed it could preserve a decisive role in Indochina. It might speak of union, federation, or partnership, but it intended to remain the power that shaped Vietnam's future. The Viet Minh, meanwhile, had accepted temporary compromise, but not permanent submission. Ho Chi Minh had negotiated, delayed, and maneuvered, yet the goal remained unchanged. Vietnam must be independent. The breaking point came not first in Hanoi, but at Haiphong. Haiphong was more than a port. It was one of northern Vietnam's vital gateways to the world, a place of ships, warehouses, rail lines, customs offices, military movements, and commercial power. Whoever controlled Haiphong controlled access. Whoever controlled access could influence the North itself. For the French, Haiphong was strategically essential. For the Viet Minh, it was a symbol of sovereignty. That made the city dangerous. In November 1946, tensions at Haiphong exploded after a dispute involving customs control and French authority. What might once have been handled through negotiation now unfolded in an atmosphere where neither side trusted the other's intentions. Shots were fired. Accusations followed. Armed men took positions. The machinery of escalation began to move. Once violence entered the streets, it became difficult to contain. French commanders believed they had to assert control. They feared weakness would invite further resistance. They feared that any compromise in Haiphong would encourage the Viet Minh elsewhere. The Viet Minh in turn saw French pressure as proof that France had never truly accepted Vietnamese independence. Events moved quickly and with terrible consequence. French naval guns opened fire on parts of Haiphong. Smoke rose over the harbor. Streets that had carried merchants, dock workers, families, and children became scenes of panic and destruction. The exact human cost would be debated, but there was no mistaking the political meaning. After Haiphong, the last illusions of peace began to die. For Vietnamese nationalists, the shelling showed what French promises were worth. It was not merely a military action, it was a warning written in fire that France would use force to settle questions of authority. For many French officers, Haiphong proved the opposite lesson. It confirmed their belief that the Viet Minh were not sincere partners in negotiation, but revolutionaries preparing a wider confrontation. Both sides left the crisis more certain of the other's bad faith. That certainty is one of the most dangerous forces in history. When men become convinced that the other side will betray them, every act becomes evidence. A troop movement becomes preparation for attack. A speech becomes propaganda. A delay becomes deception. A defensive measure becomes a threat. After Haiphong, Vietnam entered that world. In Hanoi, the atmosphere grew darker. The capital was crowded with fear. French troops occupied key positions. Viet Minh forces and militias remained present in the city. The government of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam still functioned, but its room for movement had narrowed. The streets of Hanoi, once filled with the hope of independence celebrations, now carried the sound of footsteps, whispers, and weapons being quietly prepared. The city itself seemed divided between past and future. There were French villas, administrative buildings, churches, cafes, barracks, and boulevards, reminders of the colonial world. But there were also Vietnamese flags, local committees, neighborhood defense groups, and young men willing to fight for a country that had only recently declared itself born. Hanoi was no longer merely a capital. It was a fuse. Ho Chi Minh still tried to prevent immediate disaster. He understood that war with France would be long, costly, and uncertain. The Viet Minh had courage and organization, but it did not yet have the weapons of a conventional army. France possessed artillery, armor, aircraft, experienced officers, and naval power. A direct confrontation in the cities would favor the French, but surrendering the cities without resistance would risk destroying the revolution's authority. This was the terrible calculation facing the Viet Minh leadership. To fight in Hanoi might mean losing Hanoi, but not to fight might mean losing the meaning of independence itself. In December 1946, the final threads of negotiation began to snap. French demands increased. Viet Minh preparations accelerated. The streets of Hanoi filled with barricades made from furniture, carts, sandbags, timber, and whatever else could slow an army. Neighborhoods became defensive zones, houses became positions, ordinary streets became passages into war. Across the city, people understood that something was coming. Families gathered possessions, shopkeepers lowered shutters, courtyards emptied. Young men disappeared into militia units, messengers moved through alleys, weapons were hidden, checked, and carried under cover of darkness. There are moments in history when a city seems to breathe differently. Hanoi, in those December days, was such a city. It breathed with fear. It breathed with resolve. It breathed with the knowledge that when the first great blow came, there would be no simple road back. On the 19th of December, the conflict erupted. The Viet Minh launched attacks against French positions in Hanoi. Power stations, communications points, and military targets became part of a sudden urban struggle. The city that had witnessed the declaration of independence only the year before now entered the violence that would define the next 8 years. The fighting was fierce, confused, and intimate. This was not open battlefield warfare with clear lines drawn across a map. It was war in streets, houses, courtyards, stairwells, and intersections. It was fought behind walls, through windows, across barricades, and in the shadows of buildings that had once belonged to everyday life. For French troops, the task was to regain control of the capital. For the Viet Minh, the task was different. They did not need to hold Hanoi forever. They needed to delay, to resist, to show that France could not return without cost, and to give their leadership time to withdraw into the countryside. That distinction mattered. The French were fighting for possession. The Viet Minh were fighting for survival. In the early days, Hanoi became a city of smoke, splintered doors, broken glass, and sudden gunfire. Civilians hid where they could. Some fled. Others remained trapped between forces. The sounds of battle echoed through quarters that had known occupation, hunger, celebration, and now siege. The Viet Minh fighters were often outgunned. Many carried old rifles, grenades, homemade weapons, or whatever arms had been gathered from the chaos after the Japanese surrender. Against them stood French troops with heavier firepower and greater military experience. But the Viet Minh possessed knowledge of the city and a willingness to turn its streets into a maze. They cut passages through walls. They moved through houses. They appeared, fired, vanished, and appeared again. Their purpose was not to defeat France in a single urban battle, but to make the return of French authority costly, slow, and politically unforgettable. For weeks, fighting continued. Hanoi was gradually lost to the Viet Minh as a military position, but not as a symbol. Its defense entered revolutionary memory almost immediately. It became proof that the new Vietnam would not quietly submit. It became the opening act of a larger war. Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh leadership withdrew from the city. Their future would not be decided in the boulevards of Hanoi, but in the villages, jungles, mountains, and borderlands beyond the reach of easy French control. This withdrawal was not simply retreat. It was a change in the character of the war. France could retake the capital. It could occupy administrative centers, ports, roads, and forts. It could raise flags over public buildings and declare that order had been restored. But the enemy it now faced was no longer one that needed to stand in one place. The Viet Minh would move outward. They would disappear into terrain. They would build bases where roads were poor and French power thinned. They would turn distance, patience, and political organization into weapons. The battle for Hanoi therefore revealed the central problem France would face throughout the First Indochina War. It could win ground without ending resistance. It could capture cities without capturing the revolution. It could defeat Viet Minh units in one place only to find the war reappearing somewhere else. The spark in Hanoi had lit something far larger than an uprising. It had lit a war of endurance. From this point forward, the conflict could no longer be disguised as a crisis of administration or a dispute within the French Union. It was a war between colonial restoration and national revolution. It was a war for legitimacy, for territory, for memory, and for the right to define Vietnam's future. For France, the coming years would be spent trying to impose decision on a war that refused to be decided. For the Viet Minh, the coming years would test whether sacrifice, discipline, and time could overcome aircraft, artillery, and empire. And for the people of Vietnam, the promises of 1945 now gave way to the burdens of war. Hanoi had burned. Haiphong had bled. The negotiations had failed. The First Indochina War had truly begun.